Our exhortation this morning will be brought to us by our brother Adam Winfrey, and his subject is titled simply L. And in preparation for his talk, he's asked that we read from the book of Exodus chapter 3, first 15 verses, Exodus 3, verses 1 through 15. Now Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the backside of the desert and came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. And Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called unto him out of the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Draw not nigh hither, but put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people, which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. And I am come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land unto a good land, and unto a land flowing with milk and honey, unto the place of the Canaanites, and the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel is come unto me, and I have also seen the oppression wherewith the Egyptians oppress them. Come now, therefore, and I will send thee unto Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring forth my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And Moses said unto God, Who am I, that I should go unto Pharaoh, and that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt? And he said, Certainly I will be with thee, and this shall be a token unto thee, that I have sent thee. When thou hast brought forth the people of Egypt, ye shall serve God upon this mountain. And Moses said unto God, Behold, when I come unto the children of Israel, and shall say unto them, The God of your fathers hath sent me unto you, and they shall say to me, What is his name? What shall I say unto them? And God said unto Moses, I am that I am. And he said, Thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, I am hath sent me unto you. And God said moreover unto Moses, Thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, The Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me unto you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial unto all generations. So reads Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 15. So at this time, I'd like to ask our brother Adam if he'd come forward and exhort us on the topic of L.
Howdy. Howdy. Thank you. Assuming someone would say it. I I spend most of my free time watching YouTubes and TED Talks and things like that. And one that I watched really recently was about the etymology of greetings. Etymology is the study of how phrases and language develop, and how a lot of English greetings have developed over time. Especially, basically, it was how a lot of greetings used to be bigger, but were concatenated. They were made smaller into shorter ones. So howdy was the one that surprised me the most. I didn't just say that for giggles. Howdy apparently is a contraction of how do you do, or how do you fare. And the two greetings are very distinctly different to our ears. How do you do is more proper, it's upper class. You may think of it as hoity-toity. And for me personally, it feels weird coming out of my mouth. Howdy, on the other hand, conjures up images. Cowboys, hard work, cattle rustling, lassoing, six-shooters, duels at high noon, the Old West, Native Americans, horseback rides through a dusty plain with Tim McGraw. Country music. But in fact, something I learned in this video is howdy predates even the Old West. It was used throughout our nation, I think maybe even in England. It was just, like I said before, a shortened version of how do you do. And that's just been lost to us. And we've just sort of associated it with a completely different culture than it used to be. So gods and ideas, but particularly right now, gods, like words, they become fickle over time. Cultures adopt them, mold them to their needs. They fudge some of the myths, and sometimes distort them to the point where they become unique to that culture. Probably, howdy, there we go. So probably the most famous of this is the Romans basically just stealing the Greek gods. Zeus became Jupiter, Aphrodite became Venus, Ares became Mars, Greek Heracles became Hercules. If you've seen the movie, you always think of Hercules as the Greek guy. He's actually the Roman one. And some of their stories have changed, but generally they were the same figures. Even their temples go by the same names. If you go over there, the temple of Jupiter is Zeus, the temple of Diana is Artemis, and also depending on which version of the Bible you're reading, you'll see, like especially in Acts, Paul and I think Barnabas are wandering through where it was, but they are thought to, basically the people thought that they were Zeus and Hermes. But if you look in different versions of the Bible, it says Jupiter and Mercury, so they're very interchangeable words. But this happens over time. So this passage that we just read in Exodus always confused me a little. And the piece that I wanted to focus on, there's a lot going on there, but I'll read the piece I want to focus on again. God said to Moses, I am who I am. He said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever. And we kind of lose that in translation. I am who I am is Yahweh. And you see that here and there. But my name is Yahweh, and that's the name you shall remember me by throughout all of my generations. That confused me a little because I never understood why Moses was asking for God's name. God, that's it. He's just God. And I always thought that maybe it was because the people of Israel had been in Egypt and they have their own sets of deities and they all had their names. Cyrus, Set, Isis, Shu, Tifnut. I had to Google all those. I don't know them off the top of my head. And so Moses was just trying to make a distinction. You know, there's what's your name, God? Which God are you? And God's like, oh, I'm Yahweh. But that didn't really make sense to me either. And maybe it was just commonplace to have gods to have names, and that's what Moses was looking for. But if you jump over to Exodus 6, you see a bit more of this conversation. This This is Exodus 6:3. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob as God Almighty, El Shaddai. But my name, the Lord, Jehovah, I did not make myself known to them. So El is properly translated here. El means God. So here's where things sort of get interesting. And I don't doubt that Moses was just asking for some clarification, but I think that God took this opportunity to distinguish himself from other gods. You see, as we just read, he used to be called El. And if you look at the words in Genesis, it switches back and forth between Yahweh and Jehovah and El. It uses all the words. But he says here that before you, I was just known as El. And so if we go to Genesis 28, we don't need to read the whole thing, but Genesis chapter 28, let's read the whole thing, I guess, verses 10 to 22. So this is when Jacob was fleeing from Esau after he'd stolen his birthright and his blessing. Jacob left Beersheba and set out to Haran, and when he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and laid down to sleep. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting down on earth with its top reaching heaven. And the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. There above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and I give to you and to your descendants the land which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you, your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised to you. And when Jacob woke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. He was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. Early the next morning, Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head and set up a pillar and poured oil on top of it. He called that place Bethel, though the city used to be called Luz. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and watch over me on this journey I am taking, and I will give me food to eat and clothes to wear, so that I will return safely to my father's household, then the Lord will be my God, and this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house. And all that you have, I will give, all of mine that I have, I will give to you a tenth. And so Bethel, the place, if you look throughout the Old Testament, is mentioned again and again and again and again and again and again. And all it means is the house of God. Beth is the house, El is God. And you see this also with Melchizedek, who visits Abraham after Abraham rescues Lot. Melchizedek is the priest of the Most High God. He's sort of this mysterious figure in Genesis. He just kind of shows up one day. He's the king of Salem. That's all we really know about him. When it says that he's the priest of the Most High God, that is Elohim El. So there we have El again. It's God. So El wasn't a name. It was simply the title, a title we would translate as God. And it wasn't unique to the God of Abraham. If we read Exodus 34, this is 13, verses 13 and 14. You shall tear down their altars and break their pillars and cut down their asherim. You shall worship no other God. That God there is El. For the Lord Jehovah, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. We can assume that the God, the El that Melchizedek was worshiping was the same God that Abraham worshipped, because Melchizedek, aside from just popping up in Genesis, pops up all the way in Hebrews again and is referenced as this priest that was sort of looking forward to God. He was a type of Christ in the Old Testament. So we know that was probably the same God. But by the time of Moses and the time that the Israelites were going back to the Promised Land, El was no longer a title. Much like Messiah. So Messiah, for those that you don't know, or Christ, Jesus the Messiah. Messiah, those words, as Brother Phil exhorted us on a little ago, those words just meaning anointed one, and that's it. And if you look throughout the Old Testament, a lot of the kings and other people are just the anointed ones. But it wasn't until Christ where that title became associated with one person. That's where we look as it as. It's not something we just. It's less of just a word now than it is like a title for Christ. So El became one deity back in Canaan. This is an image of El. I think he has like a fly swatter in one hand up there. Something. It's hard. It's a little hard to see. This idol was found in I forget. It was somewhere in ancient Israel. I forgot exactly where. But it's difficult to determine for me whether or not like the ancient religions of Canaan, Mesopotamia, if this guy evolved from Abraham's God, but this God was very distinct from the same God that the Hebrews worshipped. So just to talk about that point for a moment, he was the king of the gods and he was the father of them, but at some point in his mythology, he was replaced by a younger, stronger god named Hadad, who was the god of the storm and the harvest. And just to speak on Hadad for a second, whenever you read about the Baals, if it's Baals in the Old Testament, Baals is just a word like Messiah and like El, which is just a title. It just means Lord. So they were like the lords, which were kind of like the gods. But if it uses it in the singular, if it says Baal, the capital B, it was this guy. He was like the top god among the Canaanite gods. And some historians, when they look at that shift from El to Hadad, they think that the Jewish writers, when they were writing this passage in Exodus, were borrowing from that myth. They thought that there was the old god El and Yahweh was the newer, younger god. And that's not what we read in the text. That's just a theory that's out there. And in the mythology, in the Canaanite mythology, El still retains some ultimate authority, but the younger god Hadad is the king. There's also a story. I thought this was funny. So I bought a book. I don't know if I have it up here, but it's right here. Stories from Ancient Canaan, and it just has a bunch of stories from this era. And this is one of the ones. That's literally the title of it, and it's not the title that these authors made up. That's the title of the tablet that someone dug up. It's El's Drinking Party. It's really short. It's only about 30 lines, but it's a story about El, the god, just getting completely hammered. And his kids have to drag him home, and there's some other goofy things that happen in it. And at the very end, there's sort of a cure for a hangover. So it's just this really weird story, but it's associated with this god, and it kind of calls out this particular god's character in life. It really presents El as this fallible and not entirely in control, much unlike Yahweh. And it's reminiscent of the story of Elijah confronting the prophets of Baal in 1 Kings 18. So I have here, right down. So just to rehash that story, you don't have to read the whole thing, but there was sort of this competition between the prophets of Baal and the prophets and Elijah, the prophet of God. And Elijah said, okay, let's have two barbecues effectively. Like you slaughter your cow, I'll slaughter my cow, and we're going to ask our God to throw down fire from heaven and see whose God's really God. And so, the prophets of Baal wait around all day, and they're cutting themselves, and they're hollering out to God. And one of the things that Elijah says is he mocks them. It says, at noon, Elijah mocked them, saying, cry aloud, for he is a God. Either he is musing, or he's relieving himself, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he's asleep and must be awakened. So it's this very human-like version of these gods. That's not the picture that we get of the God Yahweh in the Bible. He's more of this thing that's out there, as opposed to this these gods that just have things going on in our lives. El also had a wife named Asherah, and we read that a second ago, and I'll read it again. Every once in a while, if you look, I see it on CNN now and then, and it'll say, God had a wife, the God of the Israelites had a wife. And what they're referring to there is Asherah. So they are these things called Asherah poles that they'll find next to the altars of God. And really, there's no physical pole left. They can't find them because they all rotted away. But they find like the holes in the ground where they stood, and they would put them up next to the altars of Yahweh and next to the altars of El. And so we know like that was effectively the Israelites taking in these ideas from El and incorporating them to their own beliefs. And even before they get into the land, God told them to destroy them. And we read this just before. I'll read it again. You shall tear down their altars and break their pillars and cut down their Asherim. You shall worship no other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. So even, again, before they were in the land, God knew those things were there, and he wanted to take them taken down because he didn't want them associated with him, which is what happened. And this is where we see a lot of other beliefs kind of bleed into the Abrahamic faith. And when I was younger and was taught about like how the Israelites started worshiping idols, I just assumed that they stopped worshiping God completely, but that wasn't the complete picture. The Israelites incorporated other gods into their worship of Yahweh. If you read through the Kings, you'll read how like some of the kings would take other idols and throw them into the house of God, and some of the good kings would come in and rip those out. So they were just basically making it like they were worshiping the entire pantheon and just putting Yahweh into that pantheon. And they mutated him and believed him to be incapable of things. It's something that it's one of my favorite passages because it reminds me basically where to put your trust. So I'll read it really quickly. So this is Jeremiah chapter 44, verses 15 to 18. And this, just to put the setting for this for a moment, this is in Jeremiah. So this is when the Jewish nation had been exiled, and there was a remnant still in the land, and they decided to go to Egypt and take Jeremiah with them, even though Jeremiah the prophet didn't really want to go. And then at some point they started sacrificing to other idols, and this is sort of their response to Jeremiah about why they were sacrificing to idols. Then all the men who knew their wives had made offerings to other gods, and all the women who stood by great assembly, all the people who lived in Pathros and the land of Egypt answered Jeremiah, "As for the word that you have spoken to us in the name of the Lord, in the name of Jehovah, we will not listen to you. But we will do everything that we have vowed. We will make offerings to the Queen of Heaven." The Queen of Heaven is Asherah. "And pour out drink offerings to her, as we did both we and our fathers and our kings and our officials in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. For then we had plenty of food and prospered and saw no disaster. But since we left off making offerings to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out drink offerings to her, we have lacked everything and have been consumed by the sword, by famine." And that was part of the problem that the Israelites had with idols. They weren't getting what they wanted from the worship of Jehovah, of Yahweh. And so they turned to other idols who had very specific facets and powers, like Baal-Hadad was the god of the harvest. They would worship him. And there was a goddess of the hunt, and there's various other gods and goddesses, but they would go to them and treating them to see if they could get what they wanted through them. And in Exodus, a theme is started that continues throughout Israel's history. Moses is atop Mount Sinai receiving the instructions from God. This is Exodus chapter 20, verses 2 and 4. These are a part of the Ten Commandments. "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below." And all the while God was giving this instruction and various other instructions to Moses, what were the Israelites doing? They were making an idol. They were, I forget exactly what the phrase that Aaron used, but he threw stuff into the fire and magically popped out this bull. And what's odd in that, and it's probably a coincidence because bulls are just a symbol of power, but El, the god, the Canaanite god, his symbol was a bull. Just like Zeus is represented with a lightning bolt, or like Jesus is the cross, El symbol was bull. It's possible that this belief of El had leaked into Israel's culture through merchants and travelers to Egypt, and maybe there were seeds of it before Jacob had left. But this idea of Yahweh, God, or El as the bull had leaked into their beliefs as early on as this. And Joshua's parting words to Israel were, "Therefore, be very strong to keep and to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses. Turn aside from it neither to the right hand nor to the left, that you may not mix with these nations remaining among you, or make mention of the names of their gods, or swear by them, or serve them, or bow down to them. You shall cling to the Lord your God, just as you have done to this very day." When you read through the Old Testament, Judges, your kings, and the prophets, again and again, as I said before, the biggest problem for the Israelites was their worship of the Canaanite and the Amorite pantheons, specifically Baal and Asheroth. But also ingrained in this path was polluting the concept of Yahweh with the false gods, which is something I think God was trying to obviously avoid. In Kings, when the nation divides, so you had the unified nation, which was the 12 tribes of Israel, and then when Solomon had sinned, God had told Solomon through the prophets, "Your son's not going to keep this whole kingdom. It's going to be divided into two." And the northern kingdoms, the 10 of the tribes, left David's family's reign and fell immediately under Jeroboam. And Jeroboam, the king, was sort of terrified that his people would go down and worship God in Jerusalem, which was where the one place that they were supposed to worship him. And because of this fear, he decided to build 2 altars that the people could go to instead. He built one in Bethel. He built one at the top in Dan. So here we have again is these bulls. We're back to that same thing, and that this El bleeding into what God is. So the thing about El is he had a place. He was transfixed. He had powers, but he was incapable. He was fallible. He was old. He was replaceable. He was the Lord over some things, but not everything. In the earlier records of El, he's like this big, powerful God. Because you get later on, the stories change where he's this like old man and he gets replaced. He doesn't have a lot of power, and Asherah kind of lords over him a little bit, and Hadad, of course, is like the king of the gods. But Yahweh isn't any of those things. He is capable. He's old, but he's timeless. He's not fallible. He isn't replaceable. He's Lord over all things. But those ideas about Yahweh kept creeping into the Jewish faith. And it must have been terribly frustrating for God for these ideas of him, like the concept of who he was, to get distorted again and again and again and again. And this continued until the Jews went into exile. We had some went to Egypt, but the rest went to Babylon. And that's where the Jewish scribes started writing down the stories of God and writing down their oral history of like who he was and of the people. But from that, different beliefs arose. God became harsh. He became bound to rules. And those beliefs continued on to Jesus' day. And he was more of a harsh deity than he was the loving God that brought them out of the lands. It was from this point that God needed to once again disassociate himself from these false beliefs. Through Jesus, he reminded his people that he was a God of love. And even after Jesus, God needed to work through things with the apostles to encourage this idea. And it's easy to fall into that, and it's easy to understand that was needed, because life is hard. And that's the thing that we need to remind ourselves of again and again. God is on our side. He cares about us. He loves us. Something to note that I got out of reading the myths about the Canaanite gods is they were doing their own thing. They had their own projects they were working on, and sometimes they helped humans, but mostly they didn't. They were, getting drunk and whatnot. But we are God's thing. We are his project. We are his concern. God didn't want Israel to forget that. He doesn't want us to forget that. God has put a lot of work into us and has had a lot of patience with us to understand that. And that's something we need to not forget as we go about our daily lives and things happen to us to make us doubt. God is working for us. Thanks.